Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a story that I found really interesting. Um, Veterans who were fired from federal jobs after Trump took office, and they're feeling let down, maybe even betrayed. And a lot of these veterans actually voted for Trump. They believed in his promise to shake things up in Washington. So we're going to be looking closely at a PBS NewsHour article that really unpacks this whole situation, and I think you'll agree that there's a lot more to the story than you might think at first.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on here. The article really shows how campaign promises and the reality of governing, they can sometimes be two very different things. And that's especially true when it comes to these huge policy shifts, downsizing the government.
Right, exactly. So let's take a step back for a second, give everyone some context. After Trump took office, he made a lot of cuts to the federal workforce, and this ended up hitting veterans especially hard. Did you know that almost a third of all federal employees are veterans?
Yeah, that's a really significant number. And it makes them much more sensitive to any policy changes that target those federal jobs. I think it's also important to remember that veterans are often drawn to federal employment for a few reasons. There's that sense of shared values and a familiar structure, something that can help them transition back into civilian life. And then you also have things like the GI Bill that make it a really attractive career path.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so we have a ton of veterans working for the government, and then suddenly, boom, all these jobs get cut. The article tells the stories of some of these veterans, and honestly, some of them are just heartbreaking.
Yeah, they really are. And it's the emotional responses are so powerful. It's not just about losing a job, it's about feeling betrayed. Betrayed by the very system they dedicated their lives to serving.
You said it. There's one veteran, James Stansel, an Army vet. He was let go from his job at a VA hospital in Milwaukee, and he said it felt like being shot and dumped out of a helicopter. That image is just wow.
It is powerful, isn't it? And it speaks to just how sudden and brutal these firings were. For many veterans, it was a total blindside. No warning, no explanation.
The article mentions another veteran, Nathan Hooven, who served in the Air Force. He lost his job at a VA facility. That's the Veterans Affairs, by the way. They handle health care and benefits for veterans. Anyway, he lost his job just 3 months after the new administration started.
And the thing is, he actually voted for Trump. He believed in all the campaign promises.
Right. Imagine the disillusionment. And get this. Both he and James Stansel, the guy from the VA hospital, they both say they had positive performance reviews. I mean, that makes these dismissals even more confusing, right?
Yeah, totally. It just adds to that sense of betrayal. Their service and everything they had done just didn't matter.
And it's not even just the emotional impact. Think about someone like Jared Evans. He was an Army veteran, a recreation therapist. He was fired from a VA in Salem, Virginia. He had just moved his whole family there, ready to start a new chapter. The article says he actually cried when he got the news.
Yeah, that's what gets me. This is where you really see the personal cost of these big policy decisions. We're not just talking about lost jobs. We're talking about lives being upended, dreams being shattered, the ripple effects on families and communities.
You're so right. And it really makes you think about the long-term consequences. Could these experiences make veterans less likely to trust the government? I mean, will this discourage them from working for the government in the future?
I think it's a valid concern. The government relies so much on the skills and experience of veterans. If fewer of them are willing to work for the government, it could have a huge impact on how effective the government is.
Absolutely. Now, not every veteran felt the same way. The article talks about Matthew Sims. He's an Army veteran who actually supported the idea of downsizing the government. But even he felt like it was done too harshly, like a chainsaw approach instead of a surgical approach, as he put it.
I think his perspective is interesting because it shows that there are nuances to these big political debates. Even people who agree with the general goal can disagree strongly about the methods.
That's such a great point. So we have veterans who feel betrayed, some who support the cuts but not the way it was done, and then others who are just totally shocked by the whole thing. It's a whole mix of emotions and opinions.
And it really speaks to the complexity of this issue. We need open and honest conversations about how these policy changes affect people's lives.
I totally agree. Okay, so we've heard from veterans, but what about the Trump administration? What was their perspective on all of this?
Well, the article quotes Alina Habba. She's a former member of Trump's legal team. She says that the cuts were necessary, a matter of fiscal responsibility.
Right. That was a huge part of the administration's platform from the beginning. but her comments sparked a lot of controversy too.
I'm honestly having a tough time with this quote. I mean, on the one hand, I get the fiscal responsibility argument, but she also said that maybe veterans are not fit to have a job at this moment or not willing to come to work. Wow. I mean, that seems so disrespectful to the people who have served our country. What are your thoughts on that? You know, it's interesting because that statement touches on a bigger issue in our society. Do we truly value the skills and experience that veterans bring to the workforce? Is there some kind of disconnect between military service and what employers expect?
That's a huge question, and her comments are definitely adding fuel to the fire.
For sure. And it makes you wonder if maybe there were some underlying biases that influence these decisions about job cuts.
It also makes you think about the politics of the whole thing. Remember, veterans were statistically more likely to vote for Trump in 2024. Knowing that, you have to wonder how these job cuts might have played into their decision making.
It's a fascinating point. If these veterans had known about these potential job losses, could it have changed their vote?
The article quotes Cynthia Williams, an Army veteran who didn't vote for either candidate. She said she thinks Trump voters might have thought twice if they'd known about these job cuts beforehand.
Yeah, I think that highlights how political decisions can have unintended consequences. And it emphasizes how important it is to be an informed voter and to understand the impact of policy choices.
Absolutely. So we have these job cuts, veterans who feel betrayed, and a whole lot of questions about the relationship between the government, veterans, and the workforce. But there's more to this story. We've only just scratched the surface of the potential consequences of these actions.
You're right. We need to look deeper into the long-term impacts, not just for the veterans themselves, but for the entire VA system, and ultimately for the trust between veterans and the government they served.
I totally agree. We're going to come back in a minute and unpack some of these bigger consequences. Stay with us.
This whole thing really makes you think you know about that gap that can sometimes exist between like what politicians say and what people actually experience when policies are put into practice.
That's a really good point. I mean, we've been talking about the emotional side of things, since Betrayal and all that. But let's zoom out for a second. What could these job cuts actually mean for veterans in the long run? Like, what are the bigger picture consequences?
Well, one thing that immediately comes to mind is how it could affect the VA healthcare system. Remember, we said that a lot of the federal workforce, especially within the VA, is made up of veterans.
Right.
So these cuts could lead to staff shortages, longer wait times for appointments, slower benefits processing, and maybe even a decline in the quality of care.
That's a scary thought. We're talking about people who have already sacrificed so much, and now they might face even more obstacles when they're trying to get the care they need.
Exactly. It's kind of a double whammy. You have veterans who are feeling betrayed by the government, and then you have the potential for those same cuts to make things worse for them by hurting the services they rely on.
It's almost like a vicious cycle, like if the quality of care at VA facilities goes down because of these cuts, that could make veterans even less likely to trust the government. And then they might not even bother seeking help when they need it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that could have a really serious impact on their well-being, both physically and mentally.
This whole thing also makes me think about the challenges that veterans already face when they're trying to transition back to civilian life. Finding a job, figuring out the VA system, dealing with the trauma of war. It's a lot to handle. And now, on top of all that, you're taking away a potential source of stability and support.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah.
Federal employment, especially within the VA, often provides a sense of familiarity for veterans, a sense of purpose, camaraderie. It can be a crucial step in helping them reintegrate into civilian life.
Exactly. It's not even just about the money. It's about belonging, about continuing to serve in a different way.
Right. And these job cuts could disrupt that path for a lot of veterans.
Yeah.
And that can make them feel even more isolated and unsure of where they fit in.
So we're not just talking about the immediate impact of losing a job, but also the potential long-term consequences for veterans' health, their well-being, and even their ability to transition back to civilian life.
Exactly. And I think it raises questions about whether the government is truly committed to keeping its promises to those who served our country.
It totally does. This brings us back to that question of trust. If veterans feel like their service wasn't valued, like their needs aren't being met, how is that going to affect their relationship with the government in the future?
I think that's a really crucial question. This whole experience could make them more cynical, less trusting. You might be less likely to participate in elections, less likely to get involved in civic life, even less likely to reach out to government agencies when they need help.
And that would be a loss for everyone. Veterans have so much to offer. Leadership skills, discipline, a strong work ethic. Pushing them away from the very system they dedicated their lives to protecting just doesn't make any sense.
I totally agree. We need to figure out how to bridge this divide, how to rebuild trust and make sure veterans feel valued and supported.
One thing that really stood out to me in the article was just how shocked and disbelieving a lot of the veterans were. It's like they never thought something like this could happen to them.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I think it speaks to how strong their expectations were and how deeply loyal many veterans feel toward the military and the government.
Right. I mean, they put their lives on the line, and now they're being told that their service isn't needed anymore. That's got to be a tough thing to accept.
It is. And it raises a really fundamental question about the relationship between veterans and the government. What do we, as a society, owe to the people who serve in the military, and are we fulfilling our obligations?
Oh, that's a big question. It's like we ask veterans to make these huge sacrifices, but then we don't hold up our end of the bargain.
It's a very complicated issue. But it's a conversation we need to have if we want to truly honor our veterans.
Absolutely. And this isn't just a conversation for politicians, it's a conversation for all of us. We need to understand the challenges that veterans face, we need to advocate for their needs, and we need to work towards creating a society that values their contributions.
Couldn't agree more. Our responsibility to veterans doesn't stop when they leave the military. It's an ongoing commitment.
So true. As we've been talking, I keep thinking about something Alina Habba said. When she said that maybe veterans are not fit to have a job at this moment. I'm wondering if she meant just in government or in general.
That's a good question. It kind of brings us back to that bigger debate we talked about earlier. Do we really appreciate what veterans bring to the workforce? Are there maybe some hidden biases that make us underestimate them?
It's possible. Or maybe it's just that people don't understand the skills that veterans have. Leadership, problem solving, teamwork. These are valuable skills in any job.
You're right. And I think there's a huge opportunity to connect veterans with the right jobs. We need to do a better job of showing employers just how valuable veterans can be.
I like that. It's about changing how we see veterans. Instead of viewing them as a burden, we need to see them as a valuable part of our workforce and our society.
Exactly. And I think that starts with changing the conversation.
Yeah.
Challenging those stereotypes and creating a more welcoming environment for veterans.
This has been a really eye-opening discussion. We've talked about veterans feeling betrayed, we've looked at the VA system, we've talked about the political side of things, we've covered a lot.
Yeah, we have.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to look at.
What's that?
The political side of it all. We've touched on it here and there, but I think we need to dig a little deeper into the political calculations behind these job cuts and how they might have affected the 2024 election.
I agree. It's an important part of this story. And it could have some long-lasting effects on how veterans view the political system.
All right. Let's take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into the political dimensions of this whole thing and what it might mean for veterans in the future.
All right, so we're back. And I got to say, this whole thing has really gotten me thinking about the political side of this. Like the stories about veterans and government policies and campaign promises all rolled into one.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to understand it all, we need to think about how these job cuts played into the politics of the time, especially during the 2024 election.
Okay, so remember how we said that veterans were more likely to vote for Trump than his opponent?
Right. And that makes it even more interesting. All these veterans who supported him feeling so betrayed, it challenges our ideas about political loyalty and how policy decisions can affect how people vote.
It's kind of like a weird contradiction, right?
Yeah.
These veterans, a lot of them were drawn to Trump's message about the economy and changing the government, but then they ended up being hurt by his policies in a way they probably didn't expect. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you wonder, if they had known about the possibility of losing their jobs, would they have still voted for him?
Yeah, it's impossible to say for sure, but the article does give us some interesting points of view. Remember Cynthia Williams, the Army veteran who didn't vote for either candidate? She said she thinks maybe some Trump voters would have changed their minds if they had known about the job cuts.
Yeah, and that just shows how important it is to be an informed voter. You have to understand what the consequences of these policy decisions might be. And it also suggests that maybe what was said during the campaign didn't match up with what happened when Trump was actually in office.
And when that happens, it can really damage people's trust, not just in a certain candidate or administration, but in the whole political system.
Absolutely. And if veterans who have always been a reliable group of voters start to feel disillusioned and like their votes don't matter, it could have a real impact on voter turnout and political engagement in that community.
It's like this whole situation could have a ripple effect impacting not only the veterans themselves, but also the political landscape as a whole.
For sure. And it highlights the need for more transparency and accountability in government.
Mhm.
Voters, especially those who served in the military, deserve to know how policies might affect them and their families. They need to have a say in the process.
As we're talking, I can't help but think back to that comment from Alina Habba, the one where she said, maybe veterans are not fit to have a job at this moment. I'm still thinking about that. It just seems so dismissive of all the skills and experience that veterans have.
I get it. And it brings us back to that question we've been talking about. Does our society really value the contributions of veterans?
Exactly. It's like we celebrate them when it's convenient, but when it comes to giving them real support and opportunities, we don't always follow through.
And that can make veterans feel alienated and disconnected.
Oh.
And that can make it harder for them to transition back to civilian life and find jobs that they like.
I think about the long-term effects of all this. If veterans continue to feel betrayed and like they're not valued, what does that mean for the future of military service? Will young people still want to enlist if they see how veterans are treated when they come home?
Those are important questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it shows that we need a big change in how we think about veterans' issues. It's not just about providing benefits. It's about creating a culture of respect, appreciation, and understanding.
I like that. It's about recognizing that we have a responsibility to veterans even after they leave the military. We have to make sure they're doing well and help them transition back to civilian life.
Exactly. And that takes a lot of effort. It involves government policies, but also community support and employers who are willing to hire veterans.
Yeah.
We need everyone to recognize how much veterans bring to our communities and our workforce.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. We've talked about veterans feeling betrayed and explored the challenges they face. We've also considered the political implications of these job cuts and wrestled with some tough questions about how our society treats veterans.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue with no easy answers, but I think this deep dive has helped us understand it better.
Absolutely. And I hope it encourages our listeners to keep thinking about this issue, to have conversations about it, and to advocate for veterans in their communities. Remember, veterans' stories matter, their voices deserve to be heard, and their contributions should never be taken for granted. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.